Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to the continuation of the series of videos that aims to explore and support your engagement with the core reading for topic 1, the Churchill reading, Teaching, Making a Difference, and the examination of all the historical, cultural, social, political forces that shape education in the modern age. So this section that we're moving on to now, titled Discourses of Education, is quite a critical linchpin, I suppose, in the overall chapter in terms of the argument that the authors are developing, and again requires a bit of focus on your behalf in terms of passing through the ideas and ensuring that you get your head around all of the various aspects and examples that are referred to in regards to what this discourses of education means. What is it? How is it constructed certain things within the sphere of education? So the authors begin by explaining what they mean by discourses of education. Now, just to elaborate, I suppose, and broaden this particular definition, which I feel is quite good and an excellent introduction to the notion of discourses. But I guess referring to discourses as opposed to knowledge, or when we talk about knowledge, oftentimes we'll refer to something, the knowledge, the facts within a particular field or discipline as unproblematic. The important message here is starting to understand and starting your the opening up of understanding that knowledge is never transparent, it's never innocent. It is always highly structured, and particularly in a field, particularly in a particular endeavor, be education, the knowledge that is constructed at a particular point in time, in a particular place, is something that is quite deliberate in a lot of ways. It's not something that just happens. So again, just to elaborate more on this idea of knowledge, I think a lot of the time people take knowledge for granted. And I'm not talking about necessarily the alternative facts we have in our Trump era, our current Trump era, or fake news. I'm not talking about that when there's sort of, a deliberate attempt to, say something else when you're trying to present an argument, and this notion that, you'll just say whatever needs saying in order to support that argument. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a kind of deliberate structuring of a particular knowledge base that, as the authors say, it creates authority. It creates an authority around what is known, what is truth, what is taken for granted, what is accepted, what is understood to work within a particular area. So when you start to break down knowledge and start to see it not as an innocent a kind of reflection of reality, when you see it as something that is deliberately put together and deliberately works to achieve certain aims, it can start to, again, unpack this critical viewpoint for yourself in terms of, well, what is going on here in terms of the discourse of education in regards to particular areas. And the authors go on to talk about how the discourses of certain parts of the sphere of education affect the way we think about things. So let's move on to a couple of points I wanted to highlight. So it's important to understand, what has occurred in terms of the development of the discourse in education. And the authors make an important point here when they describe that there was this shift between in-principle arguments about what should work and philosophy around, the betterment of the child and so on and so forth, children's needs, that moved, particularly in the 20th century, to arguments based on, okay, well, what can we empirically observe if we conduct large-scale experimental type surveys and observations and understand large amounts of data in terms of, for example, student learning, teacher process, what teachers are doing in the classroom and how that affects student learning, and theories that evolve out of that data. That's where we are at now, and that evolved in the 20th century, and particularly it was bolted onto the theories that were emerging in psychology in the late 19th century and certainly in the 20th century, and you had whole new fields of psychology developing. Certainly social psychology affects schooling because learning happens in social environments, but learning psychology became a discipline on its own, and it stood on its own. And obviously people like, you may have already come across people like Piaget was instrumental in that kind of development of the field that was to become learning psychology, that all, pretty much across the world, all new teachers engage with learning psychology as a foundation to their education practice, and it's really considered one of the most fundamental building blocks of the development of new teachers is the understanding of learning psychology. So you've got to understand that this is something that has developed, and rather than just take it for granted as, okay, what's going on here? You know, why has this been constructed in a certain way? Why has this taken hold of educators across the world, taken hold of their imagination in a way, and then embedded itself in all of the theories that work to try and understand what is going on with the learner, with the teacher, and the relationship that occurs there. So let's just whiz down here. Again, you can see here that in this part on page 50, the bottom of page 50, that the authors are trying to hammer home, and they do a very successful job, the argument they set out at the very beginning of the chapter, this notion where they said that dominant discourse and education are linked to taken for granted understandings and to practice as usual. So this notion that, hang on a minute, maybe we need to trouble, we need to maybe problematize, make a problem of this thing that people seem to take for granted. And when I say people, I mean academics in education, teacher educators, student teachers, schools, governments, etc. So really, they're suggesting that anything that's considered best practice, just take a step back and go, hang on a minute, why is this considered best practice? Why now? Why are we saying that this is the best practice? What underpins this knowledge / the discourse that has created the situation that says, yep, this is acceptable, this is valid, this is what we should be doing at this point in time in regards to the learning of young people, etc. So coming down to, you see here, I've highlighted large sections of this particular page because this notion of discourses of the child is something that I feel is really important to get your head around, and quite fascinating really when you start to think in yourself, many people, not just educators, take for granted certain knowledge about the child, what that means. And you've got to recall or think about that this notion of children and the child and children's needs is quite a recent invention. And it's really a 19th century invention and certainly into the 20th century. Because you're going to remember before then, children, they worked on the farm, they worked in factories, etc. And this notion of what the child is and what they need is quite a recent invention, but I won't go too much more into that. But let's just have a look here at the points that the authors focus on. I like this elaboration here where they talk about the child as being distinct and different from the adult. And this is where schooling evolved from, that, okay, the child is different. The child needs a particular environment to learn in that's different from what we classify as the adult. And then later on, we had the invention of the teenager. So again, that was another modern invention, that the teenager was a different kind of person, a different kind of learner that had particular needs. So here they talk about how when we think about how the child is characterized, what their capacities are in terms of the needs they have, in terms of the linear progression that that particular kind of human being takes from not having much knowledge and skill as they accumulate learning, and they eventually become an adult at the end of that line as a relatively straight line. And that's how it's constructed in schooling. It's why you have the grade levels and the year levels as being a linear, year 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, etc. That's a straight line. And certainly in this country, in Australia, if you weren't aware, particularly if you're a mature age student, you may not realize that across this country, young people until they reach 17 years of age are never held back in schooling. So a child, as they progress from year to year in terms of their chronological age, they simply move over to the next year level of schooling. So chronological age and levels of schooling are now parallel. They didn't used to be. Children did get held back if they couldn't meet certain standards and requirements, but no longer. So anyway, the authors talk about here that notions of the child about what decisions that should be made about how that person learns still underpin certain presumptions that are very common in education about the role of the teacher, about who should determine what is learnt. I'm talking here mostly in mainstream schooling. There are particular alternative schools that bring in children in terms of the decision making around curriculum, but on the whole, it's the adults who make those decisions, and it's the adults who design the learning. It's the adults who assess the learning and are the ones that are the gatekeepers to decide if the child is meeting the standards and is learning at a particular rate and has achieved certain things. And as well, more broadly, they construct as well not just the learning experience for the child, but they are responsible for what we call the whole learning environment, the social, behavioural, moral order of the classroom, what is right and wrong. Yes, there's student councils and things who might decide on certain behaviour management policies, etc. But on the whole, it's the adults who police that. The children don't police that. Even in upper high school, it's the adults who decide what is right and wrong in the classroom. So again, the authors point to this notion, very important, and it's still very common in excuse me, very common in talk of education in our country in terms of the kinds of goals we are looking to achieve. What does schooling do? What should it do? It's this notion of the whole child, and you very much hear that in schools, as I said, in government. This notion that it's not just about educating the mind, but it's also about the body, the healthy body. Certainly, healthy eating programs in schools. The spirit in religious schools. Obviously, there's a counselling around spirituality, a transmission of values around spirituality. The history of particular religious groups is also transmitted, and as well this notion of the heart, and by that that's now the notion of well-being, and the concept of well-being is very, very critical in modern education discourse, and it's become quite a hot topic, you might say, in schools. The well-being of teachers is important, but that tends to get put together with the well-being of the school and certainly well-being of students, and talking about, again, mental health issues as being quite a critical issue, self-harm, bullying, all of that comes around this notion of well-being. And so schools now are taking a role of the the training of well-being almost. You see schools doing meditation classes now where young people are taught how to relax because they're filled with anxieties and stress and they can't sort of calm down and relax, and this will hopefully enhance their learning, so the argument goes. As well, you have all sorts of programs around identity development, around resilience, and there's various strands in which this works in schools. And you can see, obviously I'm quite interested in this particular area because my research field is emotions in education. So, again, I take a critical viewpoint here and I go, well, what's going on here? Why are we, what's the point of all this? What is this always and everywhere a good thing? So let's now move on to this section here that I've highlighted about differentiation and how important that is and how critical that still is in education today, about how we decide about according to differences. So how does the child differ, or how does child A and child B differ? What are their individual differences? And we can look at this in a number of ways, and as the authors describe, obviously there's intelligence, and now we have this concept of multiple intelligences that's very, very common in schools. So children learn in different ways. Learning styles is a very common concept that you hear in education. If you've been paying attention to the Facebook group, you may have seen a discussion thread around learning styles in particular has fallen out of favor, and it has become a little bit of the sense of, well, actually it's probably not based on any empirical evidence. So you can see there that the link to where started this video, that what is considered good knowledge in education is now always tied to empirical evidence. So if there's no empirical evidence, well, does it exist? So again, you can see how the discourse of education is working there, that the notion of learning styles, which may be a common sense way of describing different kinds of learners in the classroom, not based on any evidence or data, we can't find it, it's not clear, so let's throw it out. So there you can see it working. So the authors describe here that they talk about the development of scientific definitions and measurements gave precision to the task of deciding differences, particularly around intelligence and ability, and enabled educationists to make scientific decisions. So again, you can see discourse working about, okay, how do we scientize education? How do we legitimize it through the bringing in a scientific method, experiments, data, and theorizing on that empirical evidence, and then how do we use that to then make decisions about what the children that we are educating, we're hoping to educate in terms of moving through school and after school, starting to get a sense of, well, what is their occupational trajectory, for example. Some kids maybe are better suited to what might call the traditional blue-collar workforce, the trade. Some students might be better suited to the professional sphere, technology, science, and arts, and all these different kinds of divisions of difference in terms of where we classify young people and how we decide what they're good at. And this is how we differentiate them, and how then schools can focus their energies as well on particular kinds of programs, be they gifted and talented programs, special sports programs, arts programs, music, etc., etc., etc. So if we then I'm going to skim down here, and a lot of this is very interesting, but I'm just going to move here towards this heading, Theory and Practice in Educational Discourse, again, just to highlight the interesting point here made in terms of reflecting for yourself around pre-service teachers and this tension. Referred to it in a previous video, but it's really important to reinforce it here because you will experience this. So the author's note for pre-service and graduate teachers, so this doesn't go away. It happens while you're learning to be a teacher, and it continues after you finish your course. But this notion of the tension between wanting to transform on the one hand and the daily pressures to perform according to the established demands and routines and common sense understandings and practices of schooling as usual. So this notion of, how do we create a transformative experience for our students? How do we make a difference? How do we really impact young people so that they can realize their potential? All of those really important aims or goals to have as a teacher. But as you move into the reality of all of the discourses of education and how it impacts practice, there's taken for granted practice, there's common sense understandings of what works, and you go to a school, say a particular kind of school. I worked for many years in a low socioeconomic school, and there were lots of common sense understandings of how to teach these type of kids, and you can imagine me doing air quotes there, that they were a particular kind of child from a particular kind of parent from a particular kind of community, and there were particular taken for granted, practice as usual, common sense methods that worked with those young people. And that was the discourse in that particular school. And that if you didn't adhere to that, if you did things that were different, that didn't fall in line with what was the sort of accepted philosophy and way of doing things, you were seen as not sort of being part of the team, as it were. And you very quickly, as a new teacher, worked out very quickly that you did have to play the game, as it were, in that you had to adhere yourself to what the school was doing, and if you did other things, you were seen as aberrant, as really, as even maybe some teachers were cast as unprofessional. So let's skim down once again. So if we move through where they're talking about particular kinds of technologies, there's quite some interesting ideas here. So if we look at the term pedagogy and what this actually means, I'm just going to stop it here, have a bit of a think about what I want to say, and then resume in the next video.